The streets of Minneapolis did not erupt all at once. They tightened slowly, like a held breath in freezing air. On a bitterly cold night, when winter pressed its weight against the city, thousands of people stepped outside anyway. Heavy coats, covered faces, gloved hands clenched not just against the cold, but against something far heavier, grief mixed with anger, and a growing sense that another line had been crossed. This was not a spontaneous gathering. This was the continuation of a wound that refused to close. Only days earlier, a 37-year-old woman, Renee Nicole Good, had been shot while sitting inside her car. The shooter was not a criminal suspect, not a stranger in the dark, but a federal immigration and customs enforcement agent. Within hours, the incident became more than a shooting. It became a national fault line. Federal authorities moved quickly to frame the event. According to the Trump administration, the agent acted in self-defense. The situation, they said, unfolded rapidly. The threat was immediate, the decision unavoidable. Local officials told a different story. They insisted the woman posed no danger, no weapon, no imminent risk, no justification, in their view, for lethal force. Two narratives emerged almost instantly, each backed by authority, each claiming legitimacy, and between them stood a public already conditioned by years of similar tragedies. By Saturday night, Minneapolis became the focal point. Despite sub-zero temperatures, thousands gathered once again. Streets filled with chants. Placards cut through the darkness. The crowd was diverse: families, students, longtime activists, first-time protesters, all drawn by a shared sense that federal immigration enforcement had crossed from policy into violence. City officials later acknowledged what many on the ground already knew: the vast majority of demonstrators remained peaceful. But peace, in moments like this, is fragile. Across the city, police maintained a heavy presence. Squad cars idled, officers stood in lines, faces obscured by helmets and breath masks. The tension was not explosive, but it was constant, humming beneath every chant and every step. Earlier that weekend, at least 30 people had already been arrested. One police officer was injured after being struck by a chunk of ice, an object as common as the streets themselves in a Minnesota winter, now transformed into a symbol of how quickly surroundings can become weapons. And then there was the hotel. On Friday night, attention shifted to the Canopy Hotel in downtown Minneapolis. Word had spread, never officially confirmed, but widely believed, that ICE agents involved in enforcement operations were staying there. Protesters gathered outside, their presence growing from dozens to hundreds. Police declared an unlawful assembly. What happened next would dominate headlines and social media feeds. According to the Minneapolis Police Department, several hundred people surrounded the building. Some individuals forced entry through an alleyway entrance. Inside, alarms sounded. Outside, the noise intensified, whistles piercing the air, drums pounding rhythmically. Bright lights flashed toward windows and doorways. Videos posted online captured the moment vividly. Protesters raising lights high, illuminating faces, walls, and insignia. The soundscape was chaotic but intentional, designed not just to be seen but to be felt. Police alleged that some demonstrators threw ice, snow, and rocks toward officers and vehicles. While no serious injuries were reported, the act itself marked a shift. From protest to confrontation, from message to pressure. Law enforcement responded in kind. Crowd control tactics were deployed, orders were shouted, lines advanced, arrests followed. By the end of the night, the standoff had dissolved, but nothing had been resolved, because Minneapolis was not alone. As the weekend unfolded, similar protests appeared across the United States. In Austin, in Seattle, in New York, in Los Angeles, different cities, same chants, different streets, same demand for accountability, transparency, and restraint. This was no longer just about one shooting. It was about the role of federal immigration enforcement in American cities, about the expanding reach of ICE operations, about fear within immigrant communities, and about a question that refuses to fade: who is protected and who is policed. The Trump administration, already under intense scrutiny for its immigration policies, found itself defending not just an agent, but a broader enforcement philosophy. Officials reiterated that ICE agents operate under strict rules of engagement, that threats are assessed in seconds, that hesitation can be fatal. But for many Americans, those assurances rang hollow. Minneapolis, after all, carries its own history. a city that became synonymous with protest after previous deaths involving law enforcement, a city where trust between authorities and communities remained strained, brittle, unfinished. Local leaders attempted to strike a careful tone. Police Chief Bob Day addressed the public directly, acknowledging the heightened emotion following recent national incidents and urging calm while investigations continued. His words were measured, his message clear. Answers would come, but not immediately. That patience, however, is difficult to ask for, especially when federal agencies are involved and when investigations move behind layers of jurisdiction. The FBI confirmed it was leading the investigation into the shooting, alongside Customs and Border Protection. The Department of Homeland Security was contacted for further information. At the time, details remained limited. And in that absence of clarity, emotion filled the gap. For protesters, the shooting symbolized a system they believe has become increasingly aggressive, increasingly insulated, and increasingly disconnected from the communities it operates within. For supporters of ICE, the incident underscored the dangers agents face daily while enforcing federal law. Two realities, one country. As night fell again over Minneapolis, the cold deepened, breath turned visible, snow crunched under boots, and still, people stayed, because for them, leaving felt like silence, and silence felt like surrender. This moment, still unfolding, is not just a test of one city's resilience. It is a measure of how America navigates the intersection of federal power, local accountability, and public trust in an era where every encounter can be recorded, replayed, and reinterpreted. The shooting of Renee Nicole Good has not yet reached its legal conclusion. Investigations continue. Facts are still being assembled, but socially, politically, emotionally, the impact has already landed. And as the protests spread beyond Minneapolis, one truth becomes clear: this is no longer a localized incident. It is part of a national reckoning, one that forces the country to confront how enforcement is carried out, how force is justified, and how quickly a single moment can ignite cities across an entire nation. To understand why Minneapolis became a spark point, one must look beyond the streets and into the structure of federal power itself. Specifically, the expanding role of immigration and customs enforcement in American cities. ICE was never designed to be invisible, but it was also never meant to be omnipresent. Over the past years, immigration enforcement has shifted from border-centric operations to deep, interior actions. Arrests no longer occur only at checkpoints or ports of entry. They now take place in neighborhoods, parking lots, workplaces, and, in cases like Minneapolis, inside vehicles on public streets. This shift has altered the psychology of enforcement. For federal agents, every encounter carries uncertainty. They operate with the assumption that threats can emerge instantly, that hesitation could be fatal. Training emphasizes rapid assessment, control, and dominance of a situation. For communities, especially immigrant communities, the same encounters feel very different. What agents call enforcement, residents often experience as intrusion. What officials describe as lawful operations, families experience as fear that does not end when agents leave, but lingers long after. The shooting of Renee Nicole Good sits squarely within this divide. Federal authorities maintain that the agent involved perceived an immediate threat and responded in self-defense. That claim now forms the backbone of the administration's position. It is repeated carefully, consistently, and without elaboration while the investigation proceeds. But local officials' insistence, the woman posed no danger, directly challenges that narrative. And when narratives clash, trust becomes the casualty. This is why the protests did not dissipate after one night. In Minneapolis, demonstrators were not simply reacting to a single incident. They were responding to an accumulated history of raids, detentions, and federal operations conducted with limited local oversight. Many protesters described ICE as operating parallel to, rather than within, community accountability structures. The presence of federal agents at the Canopy Hotel became symbolic. Hotels are temporary spaces, neutral ground. But on that night, the building transformed into a focal point of anger and visibility. Protesters did not arrive randomly. They came with intention, to be seen, to be heard, and to confront what they believed was an unaccountable force operating among them. When police declared the gathering an unlawful assembly, the situation hardened. This declaration is not merely procedural, it marks a legal threshold, one that allows officers to disperse crowds and make arrests. For demonstrators, it often feels like an erasure of legitimacy, a sudden shift from protected expression to criminalized presence. The forced entry reported by police escalated the stakes further. Authorities stated that some individuals breached an alley entrance of the hotel. Whether this act represented the intentions of the broader crowd or a smaller group within it remains a point of contention. What is clear is that once property boundaries were crossed, the response intensified. Video footage circulated rapidly. Bright lights flashed toward the building. Drums echoed. Whistles cut through the air. The imagery mattered. In the age of digital documentation, perception spreads faster than official statements. Within minutes, the scene was no longer local, it was national. Law enforcement officials reported that objects were thrown: ice, snow, rocks. The environment itself became ammunition. No serious injuries occurred, but one officer suffered minor harm. That detail, small in physical consequence, carried symbolic weight. It reinforced the administration's framing of the protests as volatile. It allowed officials to argue that enforcement personnel were under attack, not just rhetorically, but physically. This framing would soon be echoed in broader political discourse. Meanwhile, city leaders walked a narrow line. They acknowledged that most protesters acted peacefully. They confirmed that tensions were high. They urged calm. But they could not ignore the reality that federal operations had triggered unrest beyond the city's control. This raises a critical question: who governs the space where federal and local authority collide? ICE agents do not answer to city councils. Their rules of engagement are federal. Investigations into their actions are often handled by federal bodies, limiting local transparency. This separation fuels frustration, especially when outcomes are slow or opaque. The FBI's involvement in the investigation was meant to reassure the public, an independent review, a measured process. But for many protesters, it felt insufficient. Another layer of distance between action and accountability. As protests spread nationwide, patterns emerged. In Austin, demonstrators gathered outside federal buildings. In Seattle, marches echoed through downtown streets. In New York and Los Angeles, rallies linked immigration enforcement to broader concerns about policing, surveillance, and civil liberties. Each city brought its own history, but the core message remained consistent: federal enforcement, when it turns lethal, must face scrutiny equal to its power, and the Trump administration responded with resolve. Officials reiterated that ICE agents operate in dangerous conditions, that they face threats from criminal networks. That hesitation can cost lives. The administration framed criticism as ignorance of operational realities, warning that undermining enforcement could embolden criminal activity. This language resonated with supporters who view strict immigration enforcement as essential to national security, but it also deepened the divide. For critics, the administration's defense appeared reflexive, protecting institutions rather than interrogating actions. For communities already distrustful of federal power, each statement felt like confirmation that their concerns would be dismissed. Minneapolis became the case study, a city where protests are not new, where law enforcement legitimacy has been challenged before, where the line between order and unrest has repeatedly been tested. The cold nights did not deter demonstrators because the issue was not weather, it was urgency. As one protester told a local outlet, "If this can happen here, it can happen anywhere." That sentiment traveled faster than any official briefing. The national implications are impossible to ignore. Immigration enforcement is no longer a distant policy debate. It is unfolding in real time, in real neighborhoods, with irreversible consequences. The shooting has forced Americans to confront how federal power is exercised, how quickly it can turn deadly, and how little room there is for error when firearms enter civilian encounters. As investigations continue, the legal outcome remains uncertain, but socially, the impact is already etched into the public consciousness. Minneapolis did not erupt because of one decision alone. It erupted because that decision landed in a landscape already shaped by distrust, fear, and unresolved questions about authority. To understand what unfolded in Minneapolis, one must widen the lens, beyond a single city, beyond a single night, and examine how immigration enforcement has evolved into one of the most volatile fault lines in modern American governance. This is not simply a story about one shooting. It is a story about structure, authority, and escalation. Over the past decade, immigration and customs enforcement has undergone a quiet transformation. Its mandate has not changed on paper, but its operational footprint has expanded dramatically. What was once perceived as a bureaucratic agency handling deportations has increasingly taken on a posture resembling a federal policing force operating deep within civilian life. This shift did not occur suddenly. It happened incrementally. Policy changes allowed for broader interior enforcement. Task forces grew. Intelligence sharing expanded. Agents were encouraged to pursue targets beyond border zones. Vehicles, surveillance tools, and tactical training followed. Each change, individually justified, collectively reshaped how ICE interacted with the public. Cities became the new frontier. Unlike border regions, urban environments are dense, diverse, and politically complex. Federal agents operate alongside local police departments that answer to mayors, councils, and voters. Jurisdiction overlaps, but accountability does not. When an incident occurs, that gap becomes visible. In Minneapolis, that gap widened instantly after the shooting. Federal authorities controlled the investigation. Local officials fielded public outrage. The community demanded answers from institutions that did not report to them. This imbalance fuels protest. Across the United States, cities have become pressure points where federal enforcement policies collide with local values. Some municipalities cooperate fully with ICE, others limit engagement. These differences create uneven enforcement landscapes, predictable to agencies, confusing to residents. For many protesters, Minneapolis symbolized a breaking point. The death of Renee Nicole Good occurred at a moment of heightened national tension. Protests over policing, federal authority, and civil rights had already primed public consciousness. The shooting did not create unrest, it activated it, and it did so along familiar lines. Supporters of strict enforcement emphasized danger. They argued that agents face unpredictable threats. That split-second decisions are unavoidable, and that second, guessing those decisions from a distance undermines officer safety. Critics countered with a different reality. They pointed to the setting, a woman in a car. They questioned proportionality. They asked why lethal force was deployed so quickly. They demanded transparency not just after the fact, but as a governing principle. These opposing views are not merely ideological. They reflect fundamentally different understandings of security. For the federal government, security is control of borders, movements, and threats. For communities, security is trust, the assurance that power will be exercised with restraint, accountability, and humanity. When trust erodes, enforcement becomes occupation in the public imagination. This is why protests spread beyond Minneapolis. In Austin, Seattle, New York, and Los Angeles, demonstrators linked immigration enforcement to broader concerns about militarization and federal overreach. Signs referenced not only ICE, but the balance of power between Washington and local communities. The protests were decentralized, but the message was unified. Federal authority must not be insulated from public scrutiny. Law enforcement responses varied by city, but the pattern was familiar. Assemblies declared unlawful. Arrests made. Statements released emphasizing safety and order. Each step followed protocol. Each step also reinforced perceptions of distance between institutions and citizens. The Trump administration viewed the unrest through a different lens. Officials framed the protests as evidence of rising hostility toward federal officers. They warned that aggressive demonstrations could embolden criminal organizations and undermine national security. The narrative emphasized stability, portraying enforcement as a necessary bulwark against chaos. This framing resonated with a segment of the public that prioritizes law and order above all else. But it did not bridge the divide. Instead, it hardened positions. Immigration enforcement has become a proxy for deeper questions: who holds power? Who checks it? And what happens when federal authority operates in spaces traditionally governed by local norms? These questions have no easy answers. The legal framework grants ICE broad powers. The Constitution supports federal supremacy in immigration matters. But legality does not automatically confer legitimacy in the eyes of the governed. Legitimacy is earned through restraint, transparency, and accountability. In Minneapolis, those elements were perceived as absent. or at least delayed. The FBI's investigation, while procedurally appropriate, underscored the distance between community demands and institutional response. Investigations take time. Public outrage does not wait. This mismatch creates a vacuum, one filled by speculation, anger, and mobilization. Social media accelerates this process. Footage spreads before facts are established. Narratives harden before reports are released. In this environment, federal agencies face a challenge they were not designed to handle: real-time public judgment. The result is a feedback loop. Enforcement actions trigger protests. Protests prompt stronger enforcement. Stronger enforcement reinforces perceptions of occupation. And the cycle continues. Minneapolis is not unique in this regard. It is emblematic. The city's history with protest, policing, and reform has made it a national reference point. Each incident there carries amplified symbolic weight. The shooting placed ICE at the center of a conversation it has long tried to avoid, one about its role not just as an enforcement body, but as a visible actor in American civic life. For decades, immigration policy could be debated abstractly: numbers, laws, borders. But when enforcement turns lethal in a residential setting, abstraction collapses. Policy becomes personal. As winter nights grew colder, protesters still gathered, not because they expected immediate change, but because visibility itself became the objective: to be seen, to force attention, to remind authorities that silence would be contested. This moment raises a profound question for the future. Can federal enforcement continue to expand without redefining its relationship with the public? Or will each incident further erode the fragile trust required for governance to function? The answers will not come quickly. Investigations move slowly. Policy shifts take time. But the impact of this moment is already reshaping the national conversation. As the protests begin to thin and the city slowly exhales, the consequences of Minneapolis do not fade with the chance. They settle, they harden, and they begin to influence decisions far beyond the streets where they first erupted. This is the quiet phase of history, the moment after impact, when institutions assess damage, calculate risk, and decide what, if anything, must change. For federal agencies, the shooting and the protests that followed present a dilemma that has no simple resolution. Immigration enforcement is a legal mandate backed by federal authority and political will. But enforcement, when carried out in civilian spaces, carries a cost that cannot be measured only in arrests or operations completed. It is measured in legitimacy. In the aftermath, officials reiterated familiar language. Investigations are ongoing. Facts must be established. Agents acted in self-defense, according to the administration. Calm was urged. Order was emphasized. These statements were not unexpected. They were procedural, controlled, carefully framed. But outside briefing rooms, the public conversation moved in a different direction. For many Americans, the Minneapolis shooting reinforced a growing concern that federal power is increasingly insulated from local accountability. ICE agents do not answer to city councils. Federal investigations do not follow municipal timelines. This structural distance creates a sense of power without proximity, a force present but not answerable. That perception, whether accurate or not, is politically combustible. City leaders found themselves in a familiar position, responsible for public order, yet unable to directly influence the actions that sparked unrest. Minneapolis officials emphasized that most demonstrators were peaceful, drawing a clear line between protest and disorder. At the same time, police declared unlawful assemblies when tensions escalated, citing safety concerns. This dual messaging, support for peaceful protest paired with enforcement against escalation, reflects the tightrope cities now walk. They must protect constitutional rights while preventing harm. They must acknowledge public grief while enforcing the law. And they must do so under the glare of national attention. The federal response remains measured but firm. There is no indication of a policy retreat, no signal that interior enforcement will slow. Instead, the administration continues to frame the issue as one of national security and officer safety. From this perspective, backing down would invite risk, not only to agents, but to the integrity of enforcement itself. Yet history suggests that moments like this rarely pass without consequence. Public pressure reshapes priorities. Not always immediately, and not always visibly, but incrementally. Training protocols are reviewed. Operational guidelines are clarified. communication strategies are adjusted. These changes rarely make headlines, but they matter. At the same time, resistance evolves. Protest movements learn, they adapt tactics. They coordinate across cities. The demonstrations that followed the Minneapolis shooting were not isolated or spontaneous in the traditional sense. They were part of a national network of response, mobilized quickly, sustained by shared grievances, and amplified through digital platforms. This network protest culture means that future incidents will not remain local for long. A single event can trigger nationwide reaction within hours. Federal agencies must now operate with the understanding that every action may be scrutinized instantly, interpreted widely, and contested fiercely. This reality does not alter the law, but it alters the environment in which the law is enforced. The deeper question is whether enforcement models built for a different era can function effectively in this one. ICE was created in the aftermath of national trauma, designed to protect borders and internal security in a post-9/11 world. Its structure reflects that origin: centralized authority, broad discretion, and limited public visibility. But as its operations move deeper into everyday life, visibility increases, and with it, accountability demands. The Minneapolis incident forces a reckoning with that tension. Not a legal reckoning that will unfold through investigations and official findings, but a civic one. How much force is acceptable? How transparent must enforcement be? And how should federal agencies engage with communities that do not consent to their presence, but cannot legally exclude them? These are questions without consensus. Supporters of strict enforcement argue that hesitation costs lives, that agents operate under constant threat, and that political pressure should not override operational judgment. Critics argue that unchecked power erodes democracy, that enforcement without trust breeds instability, and that lethal outcomes demand structural reform. Both perspectives coexist. Neither is easily dismissed. What Minneapolis reveals is not a failure of one institution, but a strain on the system as a whole. A system trying to reconcile federal authority with local values, security with liberty, speed with accountability. As investigations proceed, facts will be established, reports will be written, conclusions will be drawn. But even when the case is closed, the impact will remain. Because this moment is not solely about what happened, it is about what it represents. It represents a country still negotiating the boundaries of power, a society wrestling with how force is used in its name, and a public increasingly unwilling to accept explanations that do not include transparency and restraint. The protests were not a verdict, they were a signal that immigration enforcement is no longer a background function of government. It is a front-line issue, watched closely, judged publicly, and contested fiercely. Whether policymakers respond with reform, resistance, or recalibration will shape the next chapter. For now, Minneapolis stands as a reminder that authority, when exercised without trust, invites challenge, and that in modern America, the distance between enforcement and the governed is narrowing, whether institutions are ready or not. The night did not announce itself with sirens. It arrived quietly, but its echoes will be heard for a long time to come.